When I returned to the farm in 1975 to work with my dad, we wanted to see if we could develop a cropping system that would be self-renewing and self-sustaining without relying on outside inputs. In the beginning, our primary objective was cash flow, so it was mostly corn, and we farmed the first year with the same materials that the previous tenant had been using in the 10 or 15 years that he farmed. So started out, most of the farm was in corn, and we gradually pulled a few acres into other parts of the rotation so we could start shifting crops, but we still ended up with continuous corn for about 3 to 4 years beyond that before we made the full switch into the rotation. We began early on by adding in a few acres of oats and a few acres of soybean, and as we went a little bit farther, we started increasing those acreages. But that first year we did a lot of comparison with organic fertilizers against what the tenant had been using before, which is primarily synthetic nitrogen at about 120 pounds an acre. And we found in all of our tests across the farm that we had very little or no difference in yields. I think the greatest difference was just under 2 bushel an acre. And we generally worked out with 15 to 20 acre plots, so I thought we had a pretty good representation there. Those equivalent yields that we got there made us go ahead and make the decision that we were going to switch everything to organics the next year. And based on that experience, I would not make that recommendation to anyone today. We did have, I think, a little bit of an advantage because my dad had worked with many farmers in the late 60s, helping them convert to organic systems. So he had a lot of other experience to rely on, and we relied on that information pretty heavily. As time went on, when we changed our rotations and started getting more variety into the cropping system, it was pretty haphazard for the first 3 years. And that settled pretty quickly into a 4-year rotation, which only lasted about a couple years before we transitioned that to a 6-year rotation. And we used that rotation for about 3 cycles, or about 18 years, and started to see some patterns develop and felt like we would do better in improving soil quality and soil health if we had more perennial grasses in the rotation. And that prompted us to develop the 9-year rotation that we moved into. But given where we were and what it took to maintain our organic certification, it took us about 6 years to be able to transition to the 9-year rotation. I consider the transition from pasture to soybean as the end and the beginning of the rotation. We transitioned from a focus on soil health and regeneration to a cropping sequence that we hope helps to preserve a little of the progress we made the previous 4 years. We learned early in the new rotation that corn produced much better following soybeans when we transitioned from the pastures. Corn was very productive following legume-rich pasture cover crop, but with grass-based pastures we had more biomass to digest. Putting soybean as first crop in the rotation increased corn yields 25 to 30%. While leaving us equivalent soybean yields. We are following up on our skip row cover crop experiment from last year with a variation of seeding rates. Last year we gave up about 25 bushels per acre. This year's corn crop, we're going to continue that experiment a little bit, but we're going to shift some differences in our seed mix for the cover crop that we sow in that, and we're going to change our corn populations and reduce those a little bit and see if that performs a little bit better. Our third crop in our rotation is barley, and it follows corn, which is not necessarily a good sequence if you're growing barley, but we need an heirloom hulless barley in some products that we manufacture. And having production here on the farm is always a little bit of supply insurance for us, even though that crop doesn't work for us very well, probably 2 years out of 4. And we're not in good barley country, so we have difficulty getting a high quality crop, but we usually can get enough quality, good enough quality to use in some of our specialty feeds. It's not pretty, but it's sound and it has good nutritional profiles. The other thing that the barley crop does for us, even if it doesn't always yield well, is that it breaks some weed patterns, and it provides us an opportunity to get a late season cover crop in that should help with soil quality and then potentially give us some grazing opportunities late in the fall or early winter. Our fourth crop in the rotation is back to soybean again, and then our fifth year we're into popcorn, and then we follow the popcorn with the reseeding of our grass for our 5 year or 4 years of pasture. We're looking at, in another year, maybe doing some experimenting and trying to switch the soybean and the popcorn in the rotation. Maybe do a little more legume mix in our cover crop and switch the popcorn. The biggest advantage I see in that is that the soybean following the popcorn would probably provide us with a much better seed bed for seeding our pasture the following year. And so that's one of the things we're going to be looking at in the next couple of years. See how we come out there. Our pastures are quite a mix. We use 3 or 4 different legumes and at least 4 different grasses in the seeding mix. And the first year on pasture, we typically cut that for hay, and then the next 3 years they're rotationally grazed. And the last few years, the pastures have done really well, but then we've had well above what is our historically typical precipitation. And in that sequence and the grazing, rotational grazing, we've gotten as much as 500 grazing days per acre off of some of our pastures. And that has been really valuable, especially when we've had a couple of pasture seedings that got washed out with really heavy rains just after seeding. But we still had enough grass to keep the rotation going.